All right. So today we're going to try to tackle a topic I think a lot of people think they understand, but maybe don't.
Yeah.
ADHD.
Yeah. It's definitely one of those things where um, people have a lot of assumptions and preconceived notions.
Yeah. You sent me over some really, really thought-provoking material to prep for this, and I have to admit, even I had to kind of check myself a few times.
Right.
Yeah, it's like, oh, wow, okay.
Mhm.
So our goal today, I think, is to get beyond, those kind of surface-level understandings of ADHD
For sure.
and really grapple with the nuances,
Yeah,
especially the hidden struggles that I think aren't always talked about.
absolutely. And to really dig into that, we're going to be drawing heavily on stoic.nu. It's a really fantastic platform for anyone who doesn't know.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of this before you sent it.
Yeah. It's dedicated to like really digging into critical social issues, and they have some really insightful pieces on the lived experience of ADHD.
See, even the name Stoket.nu is interesting, right?
Yeah.
Meaning messy in Swedish.
I love that.
It kind of sets the stage for us.
It does.
Like, it's not just about checking boxes on a, diagnostic form.
Exactly.
It hints at this whole world of complexity that we really need to unpack today.
It really does. And I think one of the points that really grabbed my attention from their work is this concept of the final step phenomenon.
Okay, yeah, tell me about that, because I read about that in the source material too, and I honestly found it a bit perplexing at first. The idea that people with ADHD often excel at the initial stages of a task,
Yes.
but then get stuck at the very end, it seems so counterintuitive.
It is. It's this almost paradoxical experience. But when you actually delve into the psychology behind it, it starts to make sense. Stugit.nude highlights how growing up with ADHD often involves a lot of negative feedback from, parents, teachers, peers, constantly being labeled as lazy, disorganized, or not living up to your potential.
So all that criticism essentially becomes internalized.
Exactly. It creates this deep-seated belief that you're inherently flawed, that you're destined to fail. So then, ironically, when you're on the verge of actually succeeding, it triggers this immense anxiety.
Wait, so it's not just a fear of failure, but almost a fear of success, because succeeding would challenge their entire self-perception.
That's exactly it. It can be incredibly disorienting to achieve something you've always believed was beyond your reach. It can shake the very foundation of your identity. And this fear can manifest in different ways, often as procrastination or an inability to just complete that final step, even if it's something small.
Wow, that's a profound insight. Listeners, I want you to think about this for a second in your own life. Have you ever experienced this final step block? Maybe you put off finishing a project or you leave that last email unanswered for days. What's going on there? Is it possible that some deeply ingrained beliefs about yourself are holding you back?
It's a question worth pondering.
It is. Keep that question in mind as we move on to another fascinating connection that Stoket.nu highlights.
Yeah, this is a big one.
The relationship between ADHD and addiction.
Now, this is an area where misconceptions abound. People don't often associate these two things, but the source material really lays out a compelling case for why this link exists.
Yeah, and it wasn't just a passing mention, right? Stoking.nu actually dives into 5 specific reasons for this connection.
They do. And each reason kind of sheds light on the neurobiological and psychological underpinnings of ADHD. The first reason they point to is dopamine deficiency.
Okay.
This is really key because dopamine is that neurotransmitter that plays a central role in our reward and motivation systems.
Right, yeah. Okay, so how does that relate to addiction?
Well, individuals with ADHD, they tend to have lower levels of dopamine activity. This means they may not experience the same level of satisfaction from everyday activities that other people do. So they might be more prone to seeking out intense experiences that trigger a stronger dopamine release,
Okay.
which can include things like drugs, alcohol, or even like excessive gaming or gambling.
So it's like their brain is wired to seek out a higher level of stimulation.
Exactly. And this is further compounded by impulsivity, which is the second reason stoic.nu highlights.
Right, because we often hear about impulsivity as a hallmark of ADHD, but how does that specifically connect to addiction?
It comes down to differences in brain development, particularly in the frontal lobe, which is responsible for what we call executive functions: planning, decision-making, impulse control. So for someone with ADHD, resisting temptations, whether it's a substance or a behavior, can be significantly more challenging. It's not that they don't want to stop. Their brain might not be sending the same stop signals.
So it's not simply a matter of willpower or making the right choice. There's a neurological component at play that we need to acknowledge.
100%. And then there's the emotional roller coaster that often accompanies ADHD, which is the third factor Stoic.U discusses. This is where we get into the concept of emotional dysregulation.
Okay, emotional dysregulation. Can we unpack that a bit? I think it's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but it's helpful to define it clearly.
Absolutely. It essentially means having difficulty regulating emotions, experiencing intense feelings that can fluctuate rapidly and be hard to manage. So imagine, like, feeling overwhelmed by sadness, anger, or frustration much more easily and intensely than others might.
And I imagine that makes substances or behaviors that offer even temporary relief or escape very, very appealing.
Exactly. When you're constantly struggling to manage your emotions, anything that promises to soothe those intense feelings, even if it's ultimately harmful, can become very tempting.
It's like the brain is seeking a way to self-medicate, even if it's not a conscious choice. Okay, we've got 3 reasons down. What are the final 2 reasons Stoic.nu connects to this ADHD addiction link?
The fourth one might surprise you. It's hyperfixation.
Wait, isn't that intense focus usually seen as a strength of ADHD? How does that become a vulnerability in the context of addiction?
It's a great question. It's all about where that laser-like focus gets directed. Imagine someone with ADHD channeling that hyperfocus into, say, online gaming or social media.
Yep.
These activities provide, like, temporary escape, intense stimulation. But they can also increase exposure to addictive substances or behaviors.
Right, it's like their strengths are being hijacked in a way.
Yeah.
Okay, so that explains hyperfixation. What's the 5th and final reason?
The 5th reason is chronic stress. Remember we were saying earlier about the ADHD nervous system often being in overdrive?
Mm-hmm.
This creates this baseline of anxiety and restlessness that can be incredibly difficult to live with. So anything that offers a respite from that tension becomes alluring.
Even if it's not healthy in the long run.
Exactly. Substances or behaviors that promise to calm the nervous system, reduce anxiety, or even just numb the intensity of those feelings can be very difficult to resist, even if the person knows intellectually that it's not a good solution.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like the brain is constantly searching for a way to regulate itself, and sometimes it reaches for, unhealthy coping mechanisms. As we're talking about these misconceptions, it's interesting to note that Stoic.nu also challenges a lot of common assumptions about ADHD itself.
Yeah.
Particularly the idea that it always presents as hyperactivity in childhood.
Absolutely. And this is so important because it leads to many people going undiagnosed, especially those who don't fit that stereotypical image of, like, a hyperactive child bouncing off the walls.
So how does ADHD actually manifest differently in those who don't fit that stereotypical presentation? Tell me more about that.
Well, one of the key concepts Stoic.NED explores is masking.
Okay.
This is where individuals with ADHD often unconsciously develop these elaborate strategies to hide their symptoms and appear normal.
So we're basically putting on a facade. But why would they do that?
Well, think about the societal stigma surrounding ADHD, especially for, like, older generations. Many people grew up in environments where mental health was rarely discussed, and any deviation from the norm was met with judgment or punishment.
So they learn to suppress their true selves to avoid criticism or rejection.
Exactly. And this masking can be incredibly effective.
Yeah.
These individuals might seem perfectly fine on the outside, holding down jobs, maintaining relationships, appearing to function well, but internally they're battling intense inattentiveness, racing thoughts, difficulty regulating their emotions.
It's like they're constantly performing, which must be incredibly exhausting. And what's even more concerning is what happens when those masked symptoms go unaddressed.
Yeah, that's where the real danger lies. Without proper recognition and treatment, ADHD can lead to a whole cascade of other challenges. Think about it. If you're constantly struggling to focus, manage your time, or control your impulses, it's going to impact your work, your relationships, and your overall well-being.
And this probably leads to a lot of misdiagnoses too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Instead of addressing the underlying ADHD, people might be treated for anxiety, depression, or even personality disorders.
Mm-hmm.
So they're getting treatment, but it's not the right treatment, which means they're not getting the specific support they need to truly thrive.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a much deeper wound. And this brings us to another crucial point that Stoic.U emphasizes: the profound impact that ADHD can have on relationships and social interactions.
Yeah, we often focus on the individual struggles, but it's essential to understand the ripple effects that extend outward. The source material provides a really insightful list of these social and emotional impacts, and it's really eye-opening.
One of the things that really struck me from their work is this idea of energy cycles. They talk about how people with ADHD often experience these intense bursts of energy and focus,
Yes.
followed by periods of extreme fatigue or burnout.
Yes. And I think this is something that many people, even those without ADHD, can relate to on some level. We all have our own energy rhythms. But for someone with ADHD, those fluctuations can be much more extreme and difficult to manage.
And I imagine that those unpredictable shifts in energy can make it challenging to maintain consistent relationships or navigate social situations.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It can lead to misunderstandings, missed deadlines, and a sense of, unreliability,
Yeah.
which can strain relationships over time.
It's like you're constantly trying to explain your internal experience to others who might not understand how your brain works.
It can feel that way.
Yeah. And then there's this social fatigue that Stokic.nu mentions,
Yes.
which I found particularly relatable. It's not just about being introverted, it's about the draining effect of constant overstimulation.
Exactly. And this goes back to the neurological differences we were discussing earlier.
Hmm.
The ADHD brain processes sensory information differently. It's like the volume is turned up on everything, making it incredibly difficult to filter out distractions and manage social interactions.
Listeners, think about a time when you felt completely drained after being in a crowded, noisy environment. Maybe you needed to retreat to a quiet space to recharge. Now imagine experiencing that level of sensory overload on a regular basis. That's what many people with ADHD are dealing with.
Yeah, it can be really overwhelming.
And then on top of that, there's the emotional weight of all the negative self-talk that often comes with ADHD.
Oh, absolutely.
You mean all those internalized messages of not good enough or always messing things up that we were talking about earlier?
Exactly. Stokic.unu highlights how years of these negative messages, often reinforced by societal judgments and misunderstandings, can have a devastating impact on self-esteem. It can create a cycle of shame and self-doubt that is incredibly difficult to break free from.
It's like carrying this invisible burden, this belief that you're fundamentally flawed or broken. And that weight can really take a toll on your relationships and your overall well-being. You know, as we're kind of wrapping up this first part of our deep dive, I keep coming back to what Stokic.enu emphasizes throughout their work, the critical need for open and honest conversations about ADHD.
I completely agree. We need to move beyond those oversimplified stereotypes and recognize the full spectrum of experiences that exist.
It's about acknowledging the challenges, but also celebrating the strengths and unique talents that often come with ADHD.
That's a fantastic point, and it's something we'll delve into further in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
Listeners, I want you to think about your own strengths, your unique way of seeing the world. Could some of those qualities be linked to your neurodiversity? Hold that question in mind as we continue this exploration.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground already, but trust me, there's so much more to uncover. Stay tuned.
So welcome back to our deep dive into ADHD. Before the break, we were talking about how ADHD doesn't just impact the individual, but sort of creates these ripple effects
Right.
that touch their relationships, their work, their sense of self.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this last point, the impact on self-esteem, that I think is particularly crucial to unpack.
You know, it's hard not to feel a bit heartbroken thinking about what Stokic.nu describes, how kids with ADHD are often just bombarded with these negative messages. Lazy, disorganized, incapable.
Yeah.
Those labels stick with you.
They really do. And over time, that constant criticism, even if well-intentioned, can really warp your self-image. And it's not just kids either. Adults with ADHD who were never diagnosed might have spent their whole lives internalizing those judgments.
So then even if they achieve things, there's this nagging voice saying it's a fluke,
Right.
that they're going to be found out.
Precisely. And this can make forming healthy relationships incredibly difficult.
Right.
How do you let someone truly see you when you're convinced that underneath it all, you're a mess?
That makes a lot of sense. It's like this fear of vulnerability, right? If someone gets too close, they'll discover the truth about you, which is that you're not good enough.
Exactly. And you see this reflected in different behavioral patterns. Some people with ADHD become incredibly withdrawn, isolating themselves to avoid that potential for rejection. Others swing in the opposite direction, becoming people pleasers, desperately trying to earn validation and prove their worth.
It's like they're stuck in this push and pull between wanting connection and fearing it at the same time. And StokeyCat.new brings up another point that I think feeds into this, the struggle with emotional regulation, which we touched on briefly in the context of addiction.
Right, but it deserves more attention because it impacts so many aspects of life with ADHD. Imagine feeling like you're always on edge, like your emotions are these wild horses that you're constantly trying to wrangle.
I love that image, trying to control these wild horses. No wonder it's exhausting.
It is. And it's not just about those big explosive outbursts of anger or frustration that people sometimes stereotype.
Right.
It's the subtler things, too. The quick shifts in mood, the irritability, the impatience that can bubble up seemingly out of nowhere.
And for someone who doesn't experience the world that way, it can be incredibly confusing.
Right.
They might misinterpret those sudden mood swings as personal attacks or signs of disinterest.
Absolutely. And that's why communication is so crucial in any relationship where one person has ADHD. It's about helping your partner, friend, or family member understand that these emotional fluctuations aren't intentional.
Right.
It's about creating a safe space where they can be honest about their struggles without fear of judgment.
And I think it's also important to emphasize that emotional dysregulation isn't a character flaw.
Yes.
It's not a sign of weakness or a lack of willpower. It's a neurological difference, a different way of experiencing and processing the world.
100%.
Yeah.
It's not something you can just snap out of. It requires understanding, patience, and often professional support to develop coping mechanisms. Which brings us back to the bigger picture that Stokey.new is highlighting.
Okay.
The need for greater awareness and education about ADHD.
Because the more we as a society understand about these neurological differences, the better equipped we are to support individuals with ADHD, right?
Exactly. And that support can be life-changing. It can mean the difference between feeling isolated and misunderstood and feeling seen, accepted, and valued for who you are.
And part of that support, I think, both from others and from ourselves, is cultivating self-compassion.
Oh, that's so important.
That's something that really resonated with me from Stokey.newsly's work. It's so easy to get caught up in those negative thought patterns, to focus on what we perceive as our shortcomings.
Absolutely. It's a natural human tendency.
Yeah.
But it's especially pronounced in individuals with ADHD who've internalized so many negative messages.
Right.
They're often their own harshest critic.
So how do we shift that? How do we start to cultivate self-compassion, especially when we've spent years beating ourselves up for our perceived failures?
It starts with awareness, noticing those negative thoughts as they arise and gently challenging them. Ask yourself, would I speak to a friend this way?
Right.
If the answer is no, then why are you speaking to yourself that way?
That's such a good question to ask. And along with challenging those negative thoughts, it's also about recognizing and celebrating the strengths that come with ADHD.
Yes.
We talked earlier about hyperfocus, which can be a double-edged sword, but when channeled effectively.
It can be an incredible superpower.
Exactly.
Think about the creativity, the innovative thinking, the ability to completely lose yourself on a project and produce amazing work.
Right.
That's the power of hyperfocus when it's harnessed effectively.
And let's not forget the energy and enthusiasm that many people with ADHD bring to the table.
Oh, for sure.
That infectious zest for life, the willingness to embrace new experiences, the ability to think outside the box. These are all valuable strengths.
Absolutely. It's about shifting the narrative from a deficit-based model to one that recognizes the unique gifts and contributions that neurodiversity brings to the table.
It's about embracing the whole person, the challenges and the triumphs, and creating a world where everyone can thrive, regardless of how their brain is wired.
Beautifully said. And before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this thought. What if, instead of trying to fit into a neurotypical mold, we started to appreciate the incredible diversity of human minds? What if we saw ADHD not as a disorder, but as a different operating system, one with its own unique set of strengths and challenges?
That's a powerful reframing. And on that note, we'll take a quick pause to gather our thoughts. When we return, we'll explore some practical strategies for navigating the challenges of ADHD and maximizing those incredible strengths. All right, so we're back and ready to wrap up our ADHD deep dive. You know, it's easy to get caught up in the challenges, right? The struggles.
Yeah.
We've explored those pretty in-depth thanks to those insights from Stokey.new.
Mm-hmm.
But now I'm curious, what about solutions? What can people actually do to kind of navigate the complexities of ADHD and actually thrive? Because it's not just about getting by.
Right. It's about harnessing those unique strengths
Yeah.
and creating a life that feels fulfilling and authentic to you. And I think the first step, as Stuckit.new emphasizes, is often the most straightforward, but also sometimes the hardest: getting a proper diagnosis.
Yeah, we touched on this earlier, but I think it's worth reiterating because so many people go undiagnosed or misdiagnosed,
Absolutely.
which means they're not getting the right kind of support.
Exactly. And a diagnosis isn't about labeling yourself
Right.
or limiting your possibilities. It's about understanding how your brain works
Mm-hmm.
and accessing the tools and strategies that can help you thrive.
So what happens after that diagnosis? What kind of support are we talking about?
Well, it can vary depending on, the individual's needs and what they're struggling with.
Right.
For some, therapy might be incredibly beneficial.
Okay.
Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT,
Yeah.
can be really helpful for developing coping mechanisms for managing impulsivity, emotional dysregulation, and negative thought patterns.
And I imagine finding a therapist who specializes in ADHD is crucial.
Oh, 100%. You want someone who understands the unique challenges of ADHD and can really tailor their approach accordingly.
And what about medication? Is that something that, like, everyone with ADHD needs?
That's a decision that should really be made in consultation with a medical professional.
Hmm.
But for some people, medication can be incredibly helpful in managing those core symptoms like inattention and hyperactivity. It can improve focus, reduce impulsivity, and help regulate emotions.
But it's not a magic bullet, right?
Right.
It's not like a cure-all.
Exactly. Medication can be a valuable tool,
Hmm.
but it's most effective when it's combined with other strategies like therapy, lifestyle changes, and, skill building.
And speaking of strategies, Stuckit.new talks a lot about the importance of structure and routine, which makes sense when you think about how the ADHD brain kind of operates. Right?
Oh, it's a game changer for many people.
Mm-hmm.
Creating predictable routines, setting clear boundaries, and really organizing your physical space
Mm-hmm.
can significantly reduce overwhelm and improve focus. It's about creating an environment that supports your brain
Right.
rather than constantly fighting against it.
Okay, can you give us some concrete examples of what that might look like in practice?
Sure. It can be as simple as establishing a consistent wake-up time and bedtime routine,
Okay.
or designating specific areas in your home for certain activities:
Mm.
work, relaxation, creative pursuits.
So kind of creating those visual and spatial cues
Exactly.
to help your brain shift gears. Okay, that makes sense. What about those everyday tasks that can feel so daunting for people with ADHD?
Yeah.
Things like paying bills on time or keeping track of appointments or remembering to pick up groceries.
Right. That's where those external tools that Stuckit.new mentions come in. Don't underestimate the power of calendars, to-do lists, reminders.
Yeah, and luckily technology has made those tools more accessible than ever before.
Right.
There are so many apps and programs designed specifically for people with ADHD to help with task management, time tracking, even noise cancellation.
And sometimes going back to basics can be surprisingly effective too.
Oh, yeah.
The physical act of writing something down can help solidify it in your memory. So don't discount the power of a good old-fashioned planner
Yeah.
or a notepad.
It's really about finding what works for you, right?
Right.
Experimenting with different strategies and tools until you create a system that really supports your unique way of thinking
100%.
and operating in the world.
And remember, this is a journey, not a destination. There will be days when you feel like you're conquering the world and days when you feel completely overwhelmed.
And that's where that self-compassion piece comes in, right?
Yes.
Being kind to yourself when you stumble, acknowledging that setbacks are part of the process.
Exactly. And remember, you're not alone in this. There's a whole community of people out there who understand what you're going through. Connecting with others, whether it's through support groups, online forums, or just talking to a trusted friend, can make a world of difference.
It's about finding your tribe,
Yeah.
those who celebrate your quirks and see the beauty in your unique way of being in the world.
Because ultimately, ADHD is just one aspect of who you are. It doesn't define you. It's a part of your story, but it's not the whole story.
And your story is one of resilience, creativity, and boundless potential. So embrace it, own it, and let your unique light shine.
Beautifully said. Listeners, I hope this deep dive has been enlightening, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit empowering.
Yeah, we've explored the challenges, uncovered some hidden strengths, and hopefully sparked some curiosity for you to continue this exploration on your own.
Keep diving deep, keep questioning, keep connecting, and never stop believing in your own amazing abilities.
That's a wrap on this deep dive into ADHD. Until next time, stay curious and keep those insightful sources coming our way.